In this episode, we are bringing together two ideas that should never be separated in responsible artificial intelligence: AI governance, managing problems during training and testing, and documenting what happened well enough to prove the organization acted with discipline. New learners sometimes imagine that the hard part is simply finding issues in the model, as if the project becomes trustworthy the moment a team notices an error or a weak pattern. In reality, that is only the beginning. A responsible organization needs to know how to respond when training data turns out to be weaker than expected, when testing reveals instability, when outputs look polished but unreliable, or when one improvement seems to create a new weakness somewhere else. Just as important, the organization needs records showing what issue appeared, how it was discovered, what evidence supported the finding, what decision was made, who approved that decision, and what changed afterward. That combination of action and evidence is what turns technical discovery into real governance. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to understand what managing training and testing issues actually means. It is not just fixing bugs and moving on. It means creating a disciplined way to identify problems, classify their seriousness, decide whether they affect compliance or fitness for purpose, assign responsibility for response, and preserve enough evidence that the response can be reviewed later by people who were not present when the issue first appeared. Some issues are small and local, such as a formatting problem in output handling or a mislabeled example that affects only a narrow slice of cases. Other issues are broader and more serious, such as data leakage, unstable behavior in difficult conditions, uneven performance across groups, or a system design that quietly encourages over-reliance during pilot use. Strong governance treats these as management problems as well as technical problems. The team is not only trying to improve the system, it is also trying to prove that it can detect weakness, respond proportionately, and preserve an honest record of that response. Many of the most important issues first appear during training because that is where the organization begins to discover whether its data, assumptions, and design choices actually support the approved use case. A team may find that the available data is less representative than expected, that labels are inconsistent, that rare but important cases are too sparse, or that training performance looks promising only because the system is learning shortcuts instead of meaningful patterns. Sometimes the problem is not a dramatic failure. It may be that the model becomes stronger on routine examples while remaining weak on the very cases the organization cares most about, or that the system becomes more fluent while actually becoming harder to supervise. Managing these issues well begins with naming them clearly. The team needs to distinguish data quality problems from model behavior problems, workflow mismatch from evaluation weakness, and temporary tuning challenges from deeper problems that call the use case itself into question. Clear classification is important because weakly defined problems often lead to weakly defined fixes, and weak fixes are difficult to defend under scrutiny. Testing then adds another layer of exposure because it reveals whether the system continues to behave acceptably when it moves beyond the controlled conditions of training. A team may discover that separate components work but fail together in integration, that outputs become unstable under messy inputs, that review thresholds do not catch borderline cases, or that performance drops when real workflow timing is introduced. These issues can be frustrating because they often challenge the confidence the team built during earlier stages of development. That frustration is exactly why disciplined issue management matters. Without structure, teams under pressure are tempted to explain away test failures, narrow the definition of success quietly, or keep retesting until they find conditions that produce a result leadership wants to see. A mature organization resists that impulse. It records the problem as it actually appears, preserves the conditions under which it appeared, and asks what the result means for risk, compliance, and readiness rather than rushing to protect the project from uncomfortable evidence. Severity assessment is one of the most important steps in managing these issues because not every weakness should trigger the same response. Some problems are cosmetic, some are operational, some affect user understanding, and some may create serious legal, fairness, safety, privacy, or accountability concerns. A system that slows down during peak demand may require performance tuning, but a system that performs unevenly in ways that could affect opportunity or access may require deeper review, scope narrowing, or even a stop decision. Strong issue management therefore asks not only what went wrong, but what kind of harm could result if the problem remains unresolved. It also asks whether the issue is isolated or systemic, easy to detect or likely to remain hidden, reversible or difficult to correct after deployment. These distinctions matter because compliance is not only about whether a team noticed a problem. It is also about whether the organization treated the problem with a seriousness proportionate to its real-world consequences. Once severity is understood, the next question is what kind of response is appropriate. And this is where many organizations reveal whether they are governing responsibly or merely improvising. Some issues can be addressed by cleaning or relabeling data, strengthening evaluation cases, changing thresholds, improving interface clarity, or refining a narrow part of the workflow. Other issues require deeper action, such as narrowing the use case, limiting the system to advisory outputs, adding stronger human review, redesigning the architecture, or postponing deployment until the weakness is better understood. A mature team does not assume every issue can be tuned away through one more round of model adjustment. It asks whether the problem sits in the data, the system design, the human process, or the governance assumptions around the project. That broader view is essential because some of the most serious training and testing issues are not model problems in the narrow sense. They are signs that the organization approved the wrong design, the wrong scope, or the wrong level of automation for the task at hand. This is also the point where escalation becomes critical. If testing reveals a weakness that could affect compliance, stakeholder harm, or the organization's ability to justify deployment, the issue should not remain trapped inside the technical team. Someone with the right authority has to know what was found and make a decision based on documented evidence rather than optimism. That may include product leadership, operational owners, legal or compliance staff, privacy or risk teams, or senior decision makers responsible for approving broader use. Good issue management, therefore, depends on clear escalation rules. The team needs to know which kinds of findings require deeper review, who must be informed, what materials must accompany that escalation, and whether deployment work should pause while the issue is considered. Without those rules, organizations often continue building around known weaknesses because nobody wants to be the first person to say the problem is serious enough to slow the project. Clear escalation protects against that kind of quiet drift. Documentation sits at the center of all of this because action without evidence is very difficult to defend later. When a training or testing issue appears, the organization should capture what was observed, when it was observed, under what conditions it appeared, what part of the system was affected, what initial hypothesis the team formed, and what steps were taken next. It should also record what dataset version, model version, threshold configuration, workflow condition, or test case set was involved, because those details are often what make the difference between a finding that can be investigated properly and a finding that becomes a vague story with no clear technical anchor. This record does not need to be written in bloated language, but it does need to be accurate, timely, and specific enough that future reviewers can reconstruct the issue. Documentation is what allows the organization to show that the weakness was not hidden, that the response was traceable, and that later claims about correction are grounded in more than memory and reassurance. The results of investigations and follow-up actions must be documented as carefully as the original issue. This means preserving not only the fact that a problem was found, but also what analysis was performed, what evidence supported the chosen remediation, what alternatives were considered, what remained unresolved, and what decision was made about readiness afterward. If a team updated the data set, changed a model parameter, added a new review step, adjusted thresholds, or limited the scope of deployment, the record should explain why that step was considered appropriate. If the issue could not be fully resolved, the record should capture the residual risk and the rationale for any decision to continue under added controls. This level of documentation is what turns troubleshooting into governance. It shows whether the organization was willing to confront the real meaning of the issue or whether it merely searched for the smallest possible change that would allow the project to keep moving. One of the most common mistakes in this area is treating issue documentation as a technical notebook rather than a compliance record. Technical detail matters, but compliance also needs evidence of process, ownership, review, and decision-making. An auditor, regulator, or internal governance reviewer may need to know who approved a fix, whether the issue affected a previously accepted risk assumption, whether affected stakeholders were considered, and whether any new testing was required before the system could proceed. That means the documentation should connect technical findings to governance decisions. It should show how the issue was classified, who reviewed it, whether it triggered escalation, whether any policy or control changes followed, and what criteria were used to determine that the response was adequate. When documentation captures only the technical patch, it often fails to prove that the organization governed the issue responsibly. Good records tell both stories at once: what changed in the system and what changed in the organization's decision process around the system. Issue tracking across time is also essential because training and testing problems rarely appear as isolated events. A pattern may emerge slowly across multiple rounds of testing, several pilot cycles, or repeated user feedback during early use. One misclassification may not be meaningful on its own, but repeated failures around similar cases may point to a deeper gap in data coverage, label quality, interpretability, oversight design, or use case definition. A mature organization therefore looks for recurrence and clustering, not just one-off correction. Documentation supports this by linking related findings, preserving historical records instead of overriding them, and making it possible to see whether a problem truly disappeared or merely changed its shape. This is especially important for compliance because repeated weakness often matters more than isolated weakness. An organization that keeps finding the same kind of issue without changing its broader approach may face a harder question later, not simply why this one error happened, but why earlier evidence did not lead to stronger governance action. Another important lesson is that documentation should preserve negative results and not only successful fixes. Teams often feel pressure to record improvements while downplaying failed attempts, abandoned ideas, or unresolved concerns. That is a mistake. Negative results are part of the compliance story because they show that the organization explored alternatives, learned from evidence, and did not hide the fact that some paths did not work. If one mitigation approach failed to reduce risk, that finding matters. If one round of retraining improved one metric but worsened another, that trade-off matters. If a proposed deployment expansion was paused because the evidence was not strong enough, that decision matters as well. Compliance is not proven by pretending everything worked smoothly. It is often proven by showing that the organization recognized where progress was incomplete and made responsible decisions anyway. Honest records support stronger trust than polished records that hide the messy but important reality of responsible system development. The connection between issue management and compliance becomes even clearer when you consider how often organizations are asked to demonstrate control rather than simply claim it. People may ask whether testing covered the approved use case, whether known weaknesses were documented, whether remediation steps were verified, whether deployment decisions reflected the actual evidence, and whether change records stayed aligned with the live system. Those questions cannot be answered well if the organization treats training and testing as technical activity that lives outside the compliance process. A strong program instead integrates them. Issue findings feed decision records. Decision records trigger new testing where needed. Testing results update risk and readiness views. And all of it is documented in a way that shows continuity across the life cycle of the system. This continuity is what makes the organization's story credible. It shows that the team did not just build a model and then write policy around it later. It governed the model while it was being shaped. A simple example makes this easier to hear. Imagine a college training and testing an AI system to help sort student support messages by urgency. During testing, the team discovers that the system performs reasonably well on direct expressions of distress, but misses more indirect language patterns used by some students. Managing that issue responsibly means more than adjusting the model and hoping for better results. The college would need to document the cases where the weakness appeared, the data and model version involved, the likely cause, the risk to students if the issue remained unresolved, the decision to escalate the finding, and the response chosen, perhaps adding more representative data. increasing human review for ambiguous messages, narrowing the system's role, and rerunning specific tests before continuing. If those steps are recorded clearly, the college can later show that it recognized a meaningful weakness, responded proportionately, and tied deployment decisions to evidence rather than convenience. That is the kind of record compliance reviewers and responsible leaders need. By the end of this topic, the central lesson should be very clear. Training and testing will uncover problems in any serious AI project, and the presence of those problems does not automatically mean the organization has failed. What matters is how the organization manages them and how well it documents the full path from discovery to decision. Strong issue management means identifying problems accurately, assessing severity honestly, choosing responses that match the real risk, escalating when needed, and preserving evidence about what happened and why. Strong documentation means keeping records of findings, analysis, decisions, unresolved concerns, retesting, approvals, and linked changes so the organization can later prove that compliance and risk management were active parts of development rather than afterthoughts. When those two practices stay connected, issues become opportunities for stronger governance instead of hidden weaknesses waiting for the wrong moment to surface. That is the heart of this episode. Responsible AI work is not only about building systems that perform. It is about building organizations that can detect weakness, act with discipline, and prove it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.